What if I told you that half of what you learned in history class was wrong? Yep, get ready to see myths crumble. Basically, we grew up believing in vintage fake news just because it was printed on paper and accompanied by a dusty map. And this video is going to sting, like ripping off a giant band-aid from your childhood. But don't worry, the pain is quick and funny, because with every myth that falls apart, you'll laugh at how humanity is amazing at telling collective lies with a straight face. Oh, and before we start, at least you didn't believe the Earth was flat, or did you?
7. The Earth has always been round. You've probably heard this story in school. In the Middle Ages, everyone thought the Earth was flat. Sounds like a video game script, right? As if humanity spent centuries afraid of falling off the edge of the planet, like a cartoon with Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. But no. Since ancient Greece, guys like Aristotle had already figured out the Earth was round. They used observations of eclipses, shadows, and even the curvature of the horizon. No spaceships, NASA telescopes, or Google Earth. Just logic and working eyes. The irony? Not even medieval monks were as dumb as some modern flat earthers with internet access and 5G. Yes, in the 21st century, with satellite photos in your pocket, people still swear they live on a giant flying disc. So why did this myth stick? Simple. 19th century authors invented this pretty version of medieval ignorance, and school books repeated it as if it were true. Pop culture, of course, helped. Movies, cartoons, and even memes sold the idea as historical fact. Moral of the story? No. Medieval people didn't think they were going to fall off the planet, but they'd probably laugh their heads off if they saw certain YouTube videos today.
6. Napoleon was short. Everyone has that image of Napoleon as an angry little dwarf, like a military smurf trying to conquer Europe. But guess what? Historical fake news. The guy was 5'6", average height for the time. Not a hobbit with a sword, just a normal Frenchman who liked to pose as master of the world. So where did this reputation come from? Blame the difference between French and British measurements. The French used a foot that was bigger than the British one. Result, when translated, Napoleon lost a few centimeters on paper, and the British enemies took advantage, turning him into the war's Funko Pop. And of course, like any good history meme, the idea stuck. It became a joke, appeared in cartoons of the time, and never left people's minds. Acid humor of the day, Napoleon wasn't a conquering smurf, but his ego was so inflated that if measured in centimeters of arrogance, he really would be giant. Moral? Don't believe everything the English put on paper. Sometimes they're just inventing a historical roast.
5. Vikings wore horned helmets. When you think of Vikings, the image comes ready-made. A blonde brute, messy beard, and a helmet with 2 huge horns. Hollywood sold it so well that it looks like an official profile photo of the guys. But, surprise, that never existed. In reality, Viking helmets were simple, made of iron or leather, without any decoration. Because, let's be honest, going into battle with 2 horns on your head is like entering a shootout wearing a satellite dish. Basically, an invitation to become target practice. So, where did the idea come from? Blame 19th century operas, where artists decided Vikings would look more theatrical with horns. Years later, Hollywood took the invention, flooded it into movies, and boom, the lie gained historical fact status. The problem is, this little invented detail completely shaped the image we have of Vikings. Instead of skilled strategists, navigators, and traders, they became caricatures of medieval cosplay. In other words, when you imagine a horned Viking, you're not seeing history. You're seeing marketing with a carnival costume. Is it starting to hurt realizing your history book basically lied to you your whole life? Take a deep breath, because this only gets worse. If so far you thought horned Vikings or miniature Napoleon were funny, get ready. The next myths will kick geniuses and even entire eras off their pedestals. Quick spoiler, even the great Einstein, the supreme brain of humanity, was once a struggling student. Yes, the guy who became synonymous with genius had a report card worthy of parental concern. So hang tight, because the next chapter will shake your faith in the myth of the innate genius.
4. Einstein was a genius from birth. When you think of Einstein, the image is always the same. The ultimate genius, a brilliant mind who was born scribbling relativity formulas in his diaper. But not really. In real life, Einstein wasn't this perfect prodigy. He got bad grades in some subjects and even had to repeat a year at school. So, if you've ever cried over a math test, relax. You're in the same league as the guy who revolutionized physics. The confusion came because, years later, the story was romanticized to create the myth of the born genius. It sold much better this way, a misunderstood prodigy from childhood who overcame everything and shined. Much more inspiring than admitting he also struggled with teachers and report cards. Irony of the day, if even Einstein was once a struggling student, maybe the universe's greatest trick is that nobody really understands high school math. Moral? Einstein wasn't born ready. He stumbled, made mistakes, and only shined later. The problem is that doesn't sell misunderstood genius t-shirts, so the myth was just more convenient.
3. The Middle Ages were only darkness. When someone says Middle Ages, most imagine a period of complete darkness. People dying from plague, witches being burned, and knights dueling in the mud. Basically, Game of Thrones on hard mode. But reality was very different. During the Middle Ages, universities appeared. Advances in mathematics were made. Gothic architecture was built that still amazes engineers today. And inventions like glasses, windmills, and even the compass emerged. So it wasn't just darkness, it was a chaotic lab of new ideas. So why did this myth stick? Blame the Renaissance. They needed to sell themselves as the return of light and progress. So they downgraded the Middle Ages to a label, the Dark Ages. Pure marketing. And it works so well that we still repeat it like parrots. Moral? The Middle Ages had plague and war, of course, but also had advancements that shaped the modern world. The problem is, nobody becomes a school hero by telling the story that universities were invented in the middle of a plague.
If it's already hard to trust history books, hang on, because the next revelation will even mess with the image of the pyramids. Yes, the same ones you saw in cartoons, mummy movies, and even in crazy WhatsApp theories. Spoiler, no, it wasn't ETs with intergalactic masons coming down from spaceships to stack stone blocks. The truth is much simpler and way less Hollywood. But don't worry, the real version is still impressive enough to knock down another comfortable myth. 2. The pyramids were built by slaves. If your mental image of the pyramids involved thousands of barefoot slaves dragging stone blocks under whips, congratulations! You just described a Hollywood movie, not historical reality. In practice, the pyramids were built by paid workers. Yes, with housing, food, and even doctors to treat injuries. Archaeologists have found entire villages constructed for these laborers, with bakeries, breweries, and everything an Egyptian worker needed to survive the job. So it wasn't exactly a hell of slavery, but rather the first mega project with recorded labor rights. Sure, it wasn't a labor paradise, but it was light years away from the myth that popular culture sold.
And where did this rumor come from? Ancient texts that exaggerated slave use in Egypt, and later, Hollywood, which preferred to sell the dramatic version, pyramids built with whips, sweat, and tears, because, let's be honest, it was way more epic on the screen. Moral? The pyramids weren't built with chains, but with beer, bread, and wages. Basically, every worker's dream, even today.
1. Columbus discovered America. The official version you heard in school is simple. Christopher Columbus in 1492 was the great hero who discovered America. Applause, fireworks, statues in public squares, and of course, a big lie! In reality, when Columbus arrived, millions of indigenous people had already been living on the continent for millennia. Not to mention the Vikings, who set foot in North America about 500 years earlier, leaving archaeological proof of their expeditions. So, Columbus didn't discover anything. He just made a giant belated check-in, like that friend who shows up to the barbecue when only cold farofa is left, insisting he organized the party. So why did this narrative stick? Because it was convenient for Europeans. Turning Columbus into the discoverer helped justify colonization, power, and territorial expansion. The real version, that he arrived on already inhabited and explored land, was far less epic for official history books. Moral? Columbus didn't discover America, but he did discover how to turn political marketing into an eternal legacy. And apparently, it worked.
Well, now that you're starting to realize your history class was actually a collection of vintage fake news, the truth is clearer than a round earth. But don't feel bad. If even the biggest historical myths fell, it's not your fault that school misled you for decades. After all, who hasn't believed the story of genius Einstein from the cradle? The moral of the story is simple. Believing in myths not only distorts our view of the past, but also shapes how we understand the present. So, if you were fooled about Napoleon's height, just imagine the rest. Want more of these inconvenient truths? Don't let another historical myth catch you off guard. Subscribe now and brace yourself, because more myth busting is coming. See you next time.